I still remember the night my world cracked open, though I was only 8 years old. Childhood should have been a time of simple joys, of laughter echoing through quiet rooms, of running barefoot in the yard until the stars came out. But for me, it was the sound of the phone ringing in the dead of night, my mother's sharp intake of breath, and then the shattering silence that followed when she whispered the words that would forever change our lives. My father was gone. An accident, sudden and merciless, had ripped him away, leaving behind nothing but photographs and echoes of his laughter. At 8 years old, I didn't yet understand the weight of grief, but I understood the emptiness. I understood the way my mother's hands trembled when she tried to braid my hair, the way her eyes stared past me into some invisible distance, as if searching for a part of her soul that had vanished with him. For a while, we floated in that emptiness, my mother and I, two fragile souls clinging to each other in a house that felt far too quiet. We survived on memories, on whispered reassurances that things would somehow be all right, though neither of us truly believed it. And then, into that void, walked Frank. At first he seemed like light. He was warm, charismatic, the kind of man who could fill a room with ease. My mother, starved of comfort and desperate to believe in love again, was drawn to him like a moth to flame. And I, a child aching for stability, convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, this was the piece we had been missing. The early days were sweet. Frank brought laughter back into our kitchen. He carried groceries with ease, told jokes at dinner, and even knelt down to tie my shoes as though he had always been meant to be there. For a while, I allowed myself to believe the fairy tale. But fairy tales have a cruel way of twisting when you least expect it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his warmth cooled. His smile hardened at the edges. The laughter in our kitchen began to carry sharp undertones, jokes that cut instead of healed. I would catch my mother's face when she thought no one was looking, her eyes no longer sparkled, they dimmed. By the time I turned 9, the first slap had already landed. It was subtle, almost hidden behind the guise of a mistake, an accident fueled by too much drink. My mother brushed it off, her voice trembling as she told me not to worry, that everything was fine. But even as a child, I knew better. Bruises don't lie. And from that moment, the fairy tale shattered. What replaced it was a nightmare. The years that followed blurred into a cycle of hope and heartbreak. There were good days, when Frank played the role of doting stepfather, teaching me how to ride a bike, buying me ice cream after school. And then there were the bad days, dark, endless nights filled with shouting, with doors slamming, with tears muffled into pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I grew up learning to read the weight in the air, to measure danger in the slant of his smile or the pitch of his voice. Childhood innocence was stripped away, replaced with vigilance, fear, and the desperate yearning for escape. My mother tried, in her own quiet ways, to shield me. She would step between us when his anger grew too sharp, absorb the blows meant for me, whisper apologies in the dark as though any of this was her fault. But I could see the light fading in her, too. She had chosen him out of loneliness, out of longing, and now she was trapped in a prison of her own making. And I, still just a child, was trapped with her. Looking back now, I realize how deeply those years carved themselves into me. They shaped the woman I would become, the decisions I would make, and the wounds I would carry long after the bruises faded. At the time, though, all I knew was survival. Each day was a battle, each night a test of endurance. And yet, even in the darkest moments, I clung to a fragile ember of hope. Hope that one day, the storm would end. Hope that one day, I would be free, but freedom, I would come to learn, always comes at a price. And mine would demand everything I had. I was 12 the first time Frank walked through our front door carrying a bouquet that didn't look like it came from the grocery store and a hardback about constellations he said he bought because my mother mentioned I loved the stars. He held both as if they weighed the same, as if pleasing us required equal skill. My mother's laugh floated down the hallway like it used to before grief made it heavy, and for a moment I let myself believe this could be the beginning of ease returning to our house, that the sharp edges of life might finally soften. He spoke softly, listened carefully, remembered details. He asked about my science fair project and whether I preferred Orion or Cassiopeia, and he looked at my mother the way people look at light after too long in a dim room. For a while, it worked. Dinners had conversation again. There was music when we washed dishes. He took us to the museum on Saturdays and the zoo on Sunday afternoons, and when he proposed 6 months later, my mother cried into her hands and said yes like she'd been holding her breath since my father died and could finally inhale. We moved into his house, the one with the wide porch and the hydrangeas that bloomed like clouds in June. I got a bedroom with a door that shut tight and a desk of my own, and a bookshelf that didn't bow under the weight of second-hand paperbacks. He told me to pick paint and didn't flinch when I chose a blue so deep it looked like 3 a.m. The first weeks felt like new shoes that didn't pinch. Then came the tiny adjustments that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. He suggested, kindly, that it would be simpler if he handled the bills because he was good with numbers. He framed it as a burden lifted from my mother's shoulders, and she smiled with relief and handed over the checkbook. He said it would be smart to consolidate accounts to avoid fees and overdrafts, and when she hesitated he kissed her forehead and said families are teams and teams don't keep secrets. She closed her account 2 days later and brought home cupcakes to celebrate how organized their life had become. He didn't like one of her friends because she talked too loudly about her divorce, and another because she overspent on purses, and another because she was negative and negativity was contagious. You need a fresh start too, he told my mother, surround yourself with people who want what we want. She stopped returning calls. The house got quieter. The music at dinner ran out mid-song and didn't get turned back on. He started having opinions about lipstick, about hemlines, about the kinds of clothes that were classic and respectable. He started using the words respectable and responsible like talismans he could hold up against anything that made him uncomfortable. My mother began asking before buying things she would once have tossed into the cart without thinking: tea towels, new spatulas, a paperback by an author she loved. Of course, he'd say when she asked, magnanimous, and on other days he would sigh and say, do we really need more clutter? The first time I saw anger rip through him it came without warning. I was 14. My mother had bought a sundress off a sale rack for a staff picnic. It was white with small blue flowers and made her look like a person who still remembered how to enjoy summer. He glanced at the receipt and laughed once, short and sharp, like a cough. Then his face changed. He said she was reckless. He said he worked too hard for her to throw money away on something she'd wear once. He didn't hit her. He picked up his dinner plate and hurled it against the wall so hard it shattered into white teeth that slid down the wallpaper, leaving a trail of marinara that looked like it had a heartbeat. No one spoke. No one moved. My mother returned the dress the next morning and came home in a gray cardigan that didn't fit. After that, I learned to read the weather in his voice. I started keeping a schedule that left the house at dawn and brought me home after dark. I joined every club I could sign up for without raising questions: debate, yearbook, environmental action, math team. I said yes to extra credit, to babysitting, to shelving books at the library on weekends. I learned how to make myself useful outside of home and invisible inside it. He didn't mind my absence, sometimes I think he preferred it. When I was there, I stayed in my blue room and did homework in silence. My mother knocked before she came in and I pretended not to hear when her breath hitching in the hallway sounded like apology. Once, junior year, I rounded a corner too quickly and found her in the bathroom, dabbing foundation across the edge of a bruise that bloomed at her cheekbone like a storm seen from far away. Doorframe, she said quickly without turning to look at me. I should really stop walking around in the dark. Her hands trembled. Mine did too. I said her name, not Mom, because it felt like we were two grown women in a small room with not enough air, and the word Mom belonged to a time when everything we needed could be fixed with a Band-Aid and a glass of water. She met my eyes in the mirror and then looked away. I begged her to leave. I listed shelters and safe apartments and the spare bed at my best friend's house and the fact that I would sleep on any floor anywhere if it meant she would come with me. She shook her head and said it was complicated, which it was, and that he wasn't always like this, which he wasn't, and that she had made vows, which she had, and that people who don't understand adult relationships shouldn't offer advice, which I suppose I didn't and did anyway. I learned then what I would spend years studying later, that cages built of shame and fear can look, from the inside, like responsibility. By 16 I could recite scholarship deadlines like a catechism. College became a rope I braided nightly, strand by strand, until I could grip it and pull. I saved babysitting money in envelopes labeled with campus names I whispered like spells. I ate lunch in the guidance office reading printouts about grants while my friends gossiped about homecoming. Frank bragged about my grades at neighborhood barbecues as if he had written my essays and taken my tests. He beamed when mail arrived with university letterhead because the envelopes made him look like the stepfather of a prodigy. He told anyone who would listen that he believed in discipline and structure and that kids today need accountability, and I nodded and folded my acceptance letters into drawers he didn't open. Boston University came with a scholarship big enough to sound like freedom. The night before I left, my mother came into my room after he'd fallen asleep and sat on the edge of my bed like she used to when my legs were still short and the world still fit inside our house. "I'm proud of you," she said, and the way her mouth formed the words made them feel like confession and benediction both. Her hand smoothed the quilt even though it didn't need smoothing. The lamp made a warm circle that didn't reach the corners, and I wondered which shadows she was thinking about while she looked at our reflections in the window. "Come with me," I said before I could swallow the words. "It doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't even have to be long. Just a beginning." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked older than her years and younger than her pain. "This is my life," she said softly. "It doesn't have to be yours." I wanted to argue. I wanted to shake her until something fell loose inside her that had been held too tightly for too long. Instead, I nodded because love taught me early that pushing a drowning person the wrong way can take you both under. Morning came with the kind of sun that pretends endings are just beginnings with different names. Frank drove us into the city in a silence he seemed to think read as stoic. He carried boxes up 3 flights without sweating, set them down like he owned the space by right, and shook hands with my roommate's parents so firmly my knuckles hurt from watching. He called me kiddo in front of strangers and I made a sound that, to someone who didn't know me, could have passed for a laugh. He slid an envelope across my desk as if he were performing for an audience. "In case of emergency," he said. "Responsible people plan ahead." I tucked it into a drawer and never cashed the check. My mother hugged me until my collarbone pressed against hers and whispered "I love you" into the place where my shoulder meets my neck like she was trying to pour courage into a body that would need it. They left. I stood in a room full of boxes and breathed like it was the first time. That first semester felt like stepping out of a closet into summer after a winter you thought would never end. I woke to quiet that didn't demand anything of me. I walked to class under trees that had the audacity to turn extravagant colors and let their leaves fall like they trusted the ground to catch them. I learned the subway map and the names of side streets and where to get coffee for less than $1.50 if you didn't mind it tasting a little like burnt toast. I learned that laughter can come back even if you don't remember where you put it last, that building a life from scratch is loud and messy and astonishingly tender when you're doing it with people who don't know what you've survived and like you anyway. I declared psychology not because I thought it would make me whole but because questions had been living under my skin for years and they needed someplace to go. Why does someone who once sang while stirring sauce become a person who asks permission to buy salt? Why does someone who buys flowers become a man who throws plates? How does a child who watches decide what to carry and what to set down? My professors wrote in the margins of my papers that I had a gift for listening to what wasn't being said. One of them, a woman whose office smelled like chamomile and whose shelves held more case studies than I knew existed, handed me a list of books and said, "There's a language for what you lived." When you learn it, you'll stop thinking your story is chaos and start seeing the pattern. I called my mother from various corners of campus at odd hours, and we spoke like people who didn't want to wake something sleeping in the next room. She told me about pruning the hydrangeas and a new recipe she'd learned, and the weather, always the weather. I told her about classes and a girl down the hall who laughed like bells, and how the library at night feels like a chapel. I did not ask the questions whose answers I could not bear to hear. I worked 20 hours a week at the information desk in the university library, where the air hummed quietly and the same elderly man came every Tuesday to read the newspapers like it was still a ceremony. I learned to cook cheap meals that lasted 3 days and tasted better on day 2. I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and discovered that, for me, solitude is a room where the windows are open. In October I turned 19 and didn't go home for the weekend because midterms were coming, and also because, if I'm honest, I was afraid the walls would recognize me and try to keep me. When I did go back for Thanksgiving, the house looked the same and nothing felt the same. Frank complimented my grades like they were trophies he had earned, and my mother set the table like she was performing a dance she'd practiced to the point her muscles no longer needed her consent. I washed the dishes and stared out the window at the black skeletons of trees and counted my breaths like currency. Back at school, I made an appointment at the counseling center after a class in which we discussed family systems, and the words on the page started to look like a map of my house. The therapist had kind eyes that didn't slide away from the hard parts. She said what happened to you was real. She said none of this is your fault. She said feelings that make no sense in the present often kept you alive in the past. She said healing is not forgetting, it's learning how to hold the memory without letting it hold you. In the spring of sophomore year, I met Eric in a seminar on abnormal psychology. He asked if he could borrow my notes and then returned them with extra diagrams he'd drawn on sticky notes because he said he thinks best with arrows. He had a laugh that made other people in the room look up and smile without meaning to. He asked before he touched my arm. He didn't press when I pulled back. He didn't make jokes about anger or grief. We started meeting at the cafe with the wobbly tables. We studied and didn't talk about families until we did, and when we did he listened like he believed me. He said something that lodged in me like a small, warm stone: surviving teaches you strength, healing teaches you softness again. The night before finals I fell asleep with flashcards on my chest and woke to the sound of my own breath, steady and even, and it felt like a kind of miracle. By the time I packed for summer, the rope I had been braiding for years was no longer just a promise. It was a bridge. I crossed it every time I stepped onto a train headed away from a house where noise meant danger and toward a skyline that looked like possibility. I didn't know then what it would cost to keep walking. I only knew that forward was the only direction I could live with. When summer break arrived, I went home with my backpack heavier from textbooks than clothes and a stomach knotted tighter than any final exam had left me. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, the hydrangeas obediently blooming, the porch freshly swept, the same welcome mat curled at the corners, but stepping inside felt like walking into a memory that hadn't been kind enough to stay in the past. Frank greeted me like a host who had rehearsed his lines. He clapped my shoulder, called me kiddo again, and asked about grades before my mother even hugged me. She appeared from the kitchen, apron on, smile small but present, and for a moment I saw the woman she once was slip through the cracks, a woman who used to hum while chopping onions, a woman who used to run her fingers absent-mindedly through my hair. Then Frank's voice cut the air, asking if dinner was ready, and the flicker of her old self vanished like steam off boiling water. Meals were careful ceremonies. He quizzed me about my classes as a fact, checking my right to exist. He praised discipline, responsibility, and self-control so often the words became background noise. My mother laughed too loudly at his jokes, set his fork just so, brought dishes before he asked. At night, I lay in my old room staring at the ceiling, the blue paint now faded, feeling the walls press closer than they had when I lived there. I counted days like prisoners count scratches on stone. Once, while folding laundry, I caught sight of a yellowing bruise blooming across my mother's wrist. She noticed my gaze and tucked her hand into her sleeve so quickly it looked like she had practiced. "It's fine," she whispered. "It was my fault." I startled him. I swallowed every word I wanted to scream because screaming in that house was an invitation for more breaking. I told myself I would endure the summer, that I would breathe campus air again soon. I took long walks around the neighborhood under the pretense of exercise. I sat in the library pretending to read but mostly just inhaling the silence. I visited old teachers, neighbors, anyone who would remind me that not all adults confused love with control. My friends from high school had scattered jobs, travels, relationships, and when they asked about home, I lied with a smile that looked like survival. One night after dinner, Frank poured himself another glass of wine and leaned back in his chair like a king surveying his kingdom. He asked me if I planned to stay in Boston after graduation. I said maybe. He shook his head and said family comes first. He said success meant nothing if you abandoned your roots. He said loyalty was the truest measure of character. My mother nodded as if his words were scripture, and I felt the air grow heavy, thick with expectations that were not mine. Later, in my room, I opened the drawer of my desk and found the old envelope he had given me when I first moved into my dorm. The check was still there, folded crisp. I held it and realized it wasn't money at all, it was a leash disguised as generosity. I slipped it back and closed the drawer with a finality that felt like a vow. When summer ended, I hugged my mother tight at the bus station. She whispered be safe into my hair, and I whispered come with me into hers, but neither of us moved. I boarded, pressed my forehead against the window, and watched her grow smaller as the bus pulled away, her figure rooted in place like someone who had forgotten how to walk. Back in Boston, the air smelled like freedom again. I threw myself into classes, into work, into building a life brick by brick. But even there, even surrounded by laughter that wasn't forced, the ghost of that house clung to me. I began to dream of it, doors slamming, plates shattering, voices rising. I woke with my heart sprinting, sweat cooling my neck, and the echo of my mother's silence ringing louder than any scream. So I stayed busy. I studied harder. I took on extra shifts. I started volunteering at a crisis hotline, listening to voices break through static, telling stories that mirrored mine in fragments. I didn't know then that listening to others would one day save me. I only knew that hearing them reminded me I wasn't the only one carrying ghosts, and that maybe, just maybe, survival could be the start of something more than endurance. By the time I reached 20, I had mastered the art of wearing masks. On the outside I looked like any other college student, papers tucked under my arm, laughter spilling from my lips when friends cracked jokes, plans for the weekend discussed over coffee that tasted too bitter but felt like belonging. Inside, though, I carried a constant weight, the memory of footsteps too loud in the hallway, the instinct to shrink whenever a voice rose, the guilt of leaving my mother behind in a house that seemed to swallow her whole. I told myself that distance was survival, that education was my ticket out, that every exam passed was one more brick in the wall between me and Frank. Yet, guilt is a stubborn companion, and it followed me into every classroom, every late-night study session, every quiet moment when the world slowed enough for my mind to remember. It was around this time that I met Martha. She was a professor in the psychology department, older, with silver strands woven proudly through her hair and eyes that seemed to see right through the facades people wore. I had enrolled in her class almost by accident, a requirement I thought would be dry, but Martha's lectures were anything but. She spoke about resilience, about trauma, about the ways people learn to carry scars invisible to the world. And as she spoke, I felt as though she were pulling the words directly out of my chest. After class one day, she stopped me as I was gathering my books. "You have a voice that carries," she said softly, "but a heart that hides. Come see me during office hours." That invitation became a lifeline. In her cramped office lined with books and soft lighting, Martha gave me space to speak truths I had never dared to say aloud. At first, I stumbled, ashamed, choking on the details of my childhood like jagged glass. But Martha never flinched. She listened, not with pity, but with the steady patience of someone who believed every word mattered. Week after week, I sat across from her and let pieces of my story unravel, and week after week, she helped me stitch them into something survivable. She introduced me to Charlotte, a counselor at the university who specialized in working with young adults carrying heavy burdens. Charlotte was younger than Martha, vibrant, with a laugh that filled the room, but her eyes carried their own depth of understanding. With Charlotte, I practiced breathing through the panic, reframing the guilt, recognizing that leaving my mother had not been betrayal but necessity. Together, these two women became anchors. For the first time in my life, I felt what it was to be surrounded not by obligation or control, but by genuine care. They reminded me that family could be chosen, that safety was possible, that my voice was worth hearing. Slowly, I began to believe them, but healing is never a straight line. There were nights when nightmares yanked me from sleep, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as though Frank were standing in the corner of my room. There were days when I would call home and hear the weariness in my mother's voice, and the guilt would crush me all over again. I wanted to rescue her, but I was still learning how to rescue myself. And then came the letter, the invitation to my mother's birthday dinner, written in her careful script, urging me to come home, to celebrate, to be a family again. My chest tightened as I read it. Part of me longed to see her, to wrap my arms around her, to remind her she wasn't alone. But another part, the wounded child inside me, trembled at the thought of Frank's presence, at the possibility of walking back into that house of shadows. I carried that letter to Martha's office, my hands shaking. She read it quietly, then looked up at me. "You don't have to go," she said firmly. "Love does not demand you place yourself back in harm's way." Charlotte echoed her words later, reminding me that boundaries were not abandonment but protection. Still, the pull was strong. My mother's voice, soft and pleading through ink, haunted me. In the end, I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and decided not to go. That night, I cried until dawn, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. I didn't know it then, but that choice, to stay away, would set the stage for everything that followed. For the reckoning. For the night that would change my life forever. For the first time, survival was no longer enough. The storm was building, and it was only a matter of time before it broke. Weeks turned into months after I chose not to go to that birthday dinner, and though my decision haunted me, it also planted the first seeds of strength I had ever claimed for myself. I poured everything into school, graduated with honors, and secured a job that allowed me to pay rent on a tiny apartment of my own. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was mine. I decorated it with second-hand furniture, filled the kitchen with the scent of coffee and cinnamon, and for the first time, when I closed the door at night, silence meant peace instead of fear. Yet even as I built this fragile independence, the past never truly loosened its grip. My phone calls with my mother remained clipped, carefully edited, her voice always carrying a tremor she tried to disguise. Frank's presence lingered in every pause, in every word she didn't say. I knew she was still tethered to him, and in many ways, so was I. One autumn evening, as leaves skittered across the sidewalks and the air turned sharp, I received another letter, this one heavier, official. It was an invitation to a family gathering, an anniversary dinner celebrating Frank and my mother's marriage. The words bled with irony, but what caught my attention was the note scribbled at the bottom in my mother's handwriting, *, please come. I need you, *. My hand shook as I read it. This wasn't about celebration. This was a plea. I took the letter to Charlotte, who sat across from me, eyes steady, voice gentle. "If you go, go on your terms," she advised. "Go not as the scared child you once were, but as the adult you've become." Her words settled deep, echoing through me as I boarded the bus back home, the same route I had taken years before, but this time with a different heart. Walking up to that house felt surreal. The porch still bore the same welcome mat, but the word welcome had faded to near invisibility, as though even the fabric had grown tired of lying. My mother opened the door before I knocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, the years melted away. She hugged me so tightly I felt her ribs press against mine, her whispered thank you warm against my ear. And then, over her shoulder, I saw him. Frank stood in the hallway, older but no less imposing. His hair had thinned, his belly rounded, but his eyes still carried that same sharpness, that same hunger for control. "Well, look who decided to remember where she came from," he said, his smile a slash across his face. My stomach tightened, but I held his gaze. This time I would not shrink. Dinner was tense, every word weighed, every glance a calculation. Frank tried his usual performance, jokes too loud, stories too grand, as though he were the sun around which we all revolved. But I watched closely, not as a frightened child, but as a witness. I noticed how my mother's hands shook as she refilled his glass, how her laughter came a beat too late, how her shoulders curled inward with every comment he made. I saw it all, and for the first time, I let myself name it for what it was: control, manipulation, cruelty. At one point, Frank leaned across the table, his voice low but sharp. "Don't forget who paid your tuition," he sneered, as if reminding me of the debt he thought bound me to him forever. I felt the old fear flicker, but it was quickly smothered by something stronger. I straightened in my chair, my voice calm, even. "And don't forget who survived in spite of it." The table went silent. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, Frank's face darkened, and in that moment, I realized the balance had shifted. I was no longer the child in his house. I was the woman who had built a life beyond his reach. That night, as I lay in my old room, staring once again at the faded blue walls, I knew the story wasn't finished. But something had changed. The fear that had once suffocated me now burned into determination. I didn't yet know how, but I understood this truth: one day, Frank would no longer hold my mother, or me, in his grip. One day, the storm would break, and we would be free. The next morning the house was quiet in that eerie way I remembered from childhood, as though silence itself was holding its breath. I found my mother in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee into chipped mugs. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with shadows that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I wanted to say something comforting, something simple like "let's leave," but the words stuck in my throat because I knew how complicated that choice would be for her. She was tangled in years of fear and obligation, a web that had grown stronger with every passing season. Frank entered a moment later, his heavy footsteps carrying the same authority they always had, and the air shifted instantly. He greeted me with a too cheerful voice, as though the tension from dinner the night before hadn't happened, as though his pride hadn't been wounded when I spoke back. That was his way: pretend, control, rewrite reality to suit himself. Throughout the day, I watched him. He snapped when the television remote wasn't where he wanted it, barked at my mother for letting the soup simmer too long, made casual comments about my future that dripped with condescension. "You'll end up back here, you know," he said at one point, lounging in his chair like a king on a crumbling throne. "Family always pulls you home." I smiled politely, but inside I felt a slow burn, the fire of someone who knew better now. My life wasn't tethered to him, no matter how much he believed it. Later that evening, when he left to meet a friend at the bar, I finally spoke to my mother with honesty I had never dared before. I told her I saw the bruises, I heard the silences, I recognized the fear she tried so hard to mask. She tried to deny it at first, shaking her head, forcing a smile that collapsed under the weight of truth. And then, as if a dam had cracked, tears streamed down her cheeks. She whispered confessions into the dim kitchen light, stories of nights she had hidden in the bathroom, mornings when apologies felt emptier than the promises they followed. My chest ached as she spoke, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope, because finally, she was speaking. Finally, she was no longer burying everything inside. I told her she didn't have to live like this, that there were shelters, counselors, places that could help. I told her I would stand by her, that leaving didn't mean weakness, that starting over was not failure. She nodded through tears, clutched my hand, whispered, "I don't know if I'm strong enough." And I whispered back, "Then borrow my strength until you find your own." When Frank returned later that night, his steps heavier, his breath tinged with alcohol, he noticed the shift in the air. Maybe it was the way my mother avoided his gaze, maybe it was the way I looked directly at him without flinching. He narrowed his eyes, muttered something about loyalty, and stomped off to bed. I lay awake long after, heart racing, mind alive with the weight of what was coming. Change was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was here, pressing against us, demanding to be faced. The following days blurred, filled with small battles and quiet victories. My mother began standing a little straighter, speaking a little clearer. I caught her humming once while making tea, a sound so faint but so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. Frank noticed too, and his anger grew sharper, his grip more desperate. But with each cruel word, my resolve hardened. I wasn't that frightened child anymore, and he knew it. The balance of power was shifting, and though the storm was far from over, for the first time I felt the winds turning in our favor. That night became the turning point I had long felt building. I woke to the sound of muffled voices drifting from the kitchen, my mother's hushed tone edged with fear and Frank's low growl heavy with menace. I slipped quietly from the bed and stood at the top of the stairs, listening as he accused her of changing, of allowing me to poison her mind with nonsense. My mother's reply was shaky but steady in its message, "I'm tired, Frank. I'm tired of living like this." For a moment, the silence that followed was more terrifying than his anger. Then came the crash of glass against the wall, her startled gasp, his footsteps stomping toward the hall. I darted back into the room, heart pounding, and slid the lock into place. My hands trembled, but for the first time, I wasn't paralyzed. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Charlotte, my fingers flying across the screen. "He's threatening her. I don't know what to do." She replied almost instantly, urging me to call the police if things escalated, reminding me I wasn't a helpless child anymore, that action was no longer impossible. The next morning Frank acted as if nothing had happened, whistling while buttering toast, his smile too wide, too false. But the mask slipped when my mother refused to sit beside him at the table. He muttered something venomous under his breath, and I caught her eyes across the kitchen. There was fear, yes, but also something else, defiance. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, flickering like a candle refusing to be extinguished. I clung to that flicker with everything in me. That afternoon I suggested we go into town, just the two of us. My mother hesitated, glancing toward Frank, who was napping in his chair. Finally, she nodded, and we slipped out quietly. At a small cafe tucked between bookshops, I held her hand across the table and told her the truth, that staying was destroying her, that love didn't mean enduring endless pain, that she deserved to be free. She cried softly, whispering about fear of the unknown, about years of believing she had no choice. And I told her, voice steady, that she wasn't alone anymore. That whatever steps she took, I would walk beside her. By the time we returned, the sky had darkened, the wind rattling the windows like a warning. Frank was waiting, his face tight with suspicion. He asked where we had been, his tone sharp. My mother straightened her back and said simply, "Out." It was a single word, but the strength in it startled even me. Frank's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but he said nothing more. That silence was louder than any scream. It was the silence of a man realizing control was slipping from his grasp. That night, as I lay awake listening to the storm battering the house, I felt a shift deep inside me. For years I had carried fear like a second skin, letting it dictate every choice. But now, with my mother's quiet courage blooming, I understood something vital: fear only had power if we let it. And for the first time, I wasn't willing to let it. The reckoning was coming, and I knew Frank could feel it too. His reign of intimidation was nearing its end. The storm wasn't just outside, it was within these walls, and soon, it would break. The days that followed felt like walking on a trembling bridge suspended above a raging river, each step uncertain but carrying us closer to something inevitable. Frank's temper grew sharper, his patience thinner, and yet my mother stood a little taller with each passing sunrise. It was as though she had discovered a fragment of strength buried deep within, and now that it had surfaced, she could not push it back down. I saw it in the way she moved around the house, no longer rushing to meet his demands, no longer apologizing for every imagined mistake. And I saw it in Frank too, the way his eyes narrowed at her newfound confidence, the way his grip on control seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. One evening, the tension finally snapped. We sat at dinner, the air thick with unspoken words, when Frank slammed his fork against the plate and demanded to know what was happening. His voice thundered through the room, accusing my mother of betrayal, accusing me of turning her against him. My mother flinched but did not break. She placed her hands on the table, her knuckles pale, and with a voice steadier than I had ever heard, she said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with power. For a long moment Frank simply stared at her, his face twisting with disbelief, then fury. He rose so quickly his chair toppled backward, but this time I rose too. I stepped between them, my body shaking but my voice firm. "You don't control her anymore. You never controlled me, and you won't win this time." His eyes bored into mine, dark and seething, but I didn't look away. For years I had avoided his gaze, shrinking into silence, but now I held it, unflinching, and in that defiance, I saw the first flicker of doubt in him. He muttered curses, his fists clenching, but he didn't strike. Perhaps he knew the police would be called, perhaps he sensed that his power was already gone. He stormed out of the house, the door slamming so hard the windows rattled, and the echo of his absence filled the room with an almost holy quiet. My mother's shoulders sagged, her face buried in her hands as tears poured out, but they were not the same tears of fear I had seen for so long. These were tears of release, of something breaking open at last. I knelt beside her, wrapped my arms around her, and whispered, "It's over, Mom. It's finally over." But even as I said it, I knew the fight was not entirely finished. Men like Frank didn't simply disappear, and fear doesn't vanish overnight. But the spell had broken. The grip he held over us for years had cracked, and through that crack poured the first light of freedom. The next morning, we packed bags quietly, deliberately, while Frank was gone. Every folded shirt, every tucked away photograph felt like reclaiming a piece of ourselves he had stolen. My mother hesitated over small things, an old vase, a wedding photo, and finally left them behind, saying, "Those belong to him, not to me." We walked out of the house together, not sneaking, not running, but walking, our steps in rhythm, our breaths aligned. When the door closed behind us, it was not with fear but with finality. Outside, the air was cool, crisp, alive with the scent of wet earth from last night's rain. My mother tilted her face upward as though feeling sunlight for the first time. And I knew then that this was not just an ending, it was a beginning. We had chosen to step into uncertainty, yes, but it was our choice, no longer dictated by his anger or control. The road ahead would be hard, filled with questions and rebuilding, but it was ours to walk. And with every step, I felt lighter, stronger, as though the chains I had carried since childhood were finally gone. That evening, as we sat in Charlotte's apartment with cups of tea warming our hands, my mother whispered, "I never thought I'd be free." I looked at her, at the lines on her face carved by years of endurance, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and I realized she already was. She had been free the moment she spoke those words at the dinner table, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Everything after that was simply following the truth she had already claimed, and for the first time, I let myself believe in something bigger than survival. I believed in healing. I believed in freedom. And I believed that our story, though scarred, was far from over. It was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a shape I had never known before. At first, the silence felt strange, almost haunting, because I had grown so used to the constant background noise of Frank's footsteps, his voice barking commands, the clatter of objects thrown in anger. But slowly that silence transformed into something beautiful. It became the sound of safety, the sound of mornings where my mother and I could sip tea without flinching at every creak of the floorboards, the sound of laughter that came easier with each passing day. My mother started rediscovering small joys, reading by the window without being interrupted, tending to a small plant Charlotte had given her, even humming again while cooking. Each little action was a rebellion against the years she had been forced into stillness, and each day she grew stronger. Of course, Frank did not disappear quietly. There were calls, angry messages, and one evening he even showed up outside Charlotte's building, shouting accusations into the night air. But this time, we were not alone. The neighbors called the police before I even reached for the phone, and Frank was escorted away, his threats echoing into the distance but carrying no real power anymore. The law had finally taken notice, and a restraining order followed. It was more than a piece of paper, it was a boundary, a declaration that his control was no longer recognized. Watching my mother sign those documents, I realized she wasn't just signing for protection. She was signing for her own future. With Frank's shadow pushed further away, we began piecing together something that resembled a new life. We found a small apartment, nothing grand, but it was ours. The walls were bare at first, but they felt like freedom. Together we painted them, laughing when streaks of blue ended up on our hands and faces. We filled the rooms with second-hand furniture, mismatched but full of stories waiting to be written. For the first time in decades, my mother had a space where she could breathe, where she could move without fear, where she could simply exist and be herself, and in those quiet evenings, sitting on the worn couch with cups of tea between us, we began to talk, not just about the past, but about dreams. My mother spoke about taking a class in painting, something she had once loved before Frank's voice told her it was a waste of time. I encouraged her, telling her it was never too late to reclaim what was stolen. She smiled in a way I had not seen since I was a child, her eyes sparkling with something close to hope. As for me, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The guilt I once carried about leaving her behind was replaced with the knowledge that I had helped her step into freedom, that together we had broken a cycle that could have stretched on forever. There were still difficult days, of course. Healing isn't a straight path. Sometimes a sound or a smell would pull her back into memories she tried to forget, and she would sit quietly, lost in thought. But now, instead of burying it, she spoke. She shared her pain, and in speaking, she lessened its grip. And I listened, always, because I knew how much silence had once cost us. One afternoon, months later, as we walked through a park filled with families and laughter, she turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd live to see this kind of peace." Her voice cracked, but there was pride in it too. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder and replied, "This peace was always waiting for you. We just had to claim it." And in that moment, under the shade of blooming trees, I realized something important. Our story wasn't just about survival, or even about revenge against the cruelty we had endured. It was about freedom, about reclaiming joy, about proving that even after years of darkness, the light can still find its way in. It was about knowing that the scars didn't define us, they reminded us of what we overcame. That is the legacy I choose to carry forward, and it is the legacy my mother now lives each day. Not one of fear, but of quiet strength. Not one of silence, but of laughter that rings clear and true. And though Frank may linger as a figure in our past, he no longer holds the pen. The story is ours now. Entirely, irrevocably, ours. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of memory, though the scars remain etched in both body and spirit. As I look back now, it feels almost impossible to reconcile the woman I see before me with the one who once trembled at the sound of footsteps in the hall. My mother has grown into someone I always believed she could be: resilient, free, and unafraid to claim joy. The journey was not easy, and the path was never straight, but every falter, every tear, every small act of courage brought us here. And here is not a mansion filled with riches or a life untouched by pain. Here is simply peace, the priceless kind that can't be stolen once you've fought for it. I often think about how silence once wrapped around us like chains. How many dinners were eaten in fear, how many nights passed in dread of what tomorrow might bring. And then I think about how that silence was broken, not by shouting, not by violence, but by the quiet strength of a single sentence: "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Those words became a key, unlocking a door we had thought sealed forever. They were the first crack of light in a room that had known only darkness, the first breath after years of suffocation. Now the days are filled with small rituals that remind us freedom is not an idea but a practice. My mother paints flowers with colors so vivid they seem to burst from the canvas, reclaiming beauty in a world that once told her she was unworthy of it. I write down our story, not to dwell on the pain, but to honor the strength it took to rise above it. And together we fill the air with laughter, a sound we once believed had no place in our home. Laughter is our victory, our declaration that love triumphed over fear. Yet the shadows of the past do not vanish completely. Sometimes a slammed door or a raised voice on the street will make her flinch. Sometimes the memories of nights spent in tears creep back into her eyes. But instead of burying those moments, she faces them, breathes through them, and lets them pass. Healing, I have learned, is not about erasing the past, it's about learning to live beside it without letting it control you. And so we carry our scars with pride, as proof not only of what we endured but of what we overcame. When I think of Frank now, he no longer appears as the towering figure of fear he once was. He is small, diminished, powerless. His anger may still exist somewhere out there, but it no longer touches us. He became a chapter in our book, but he did not get to write the ending. We did. And in writing it, we discovered that revenge is not always about striking back, it is about living well, about reclaiming the life that was stolen and choosing joy over bitterness. That is the truest form of justice. I share this story not because it is unique, but because it is not. So many live in silence, believing they are powerless, believing they are alone. To you I say, the moment you speak, the moment you stand, the moment you claim even the smallest piece of your voice, you begin to break the chains. It may take time, it may take tears, it may take every ounce of strength you have, but freedom is possible. Healing is possible. Joy is possible. So now, as we close this chapter together, I turn to you. Have you ever found the courage to say, enough? Have you ever stepped out of fear into freedom? Or are you still searching for the light in your own story? I invite you to share your thoughts, your journeys, your voices in the comments below. Because each story matters, each voice matters, and perhaps yours will be the light that helps someone else find their way out of the dark.